koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai. Welcome to this Musselburgh Baptist Church public forum on New Zealand's mental health crisis. This evening is being run in conjunction with the Centre for Theology and Public Issues at the University of Otago and with the Musselburgh Rise Community Trust. Ko pukakohi toko monga, ko limbang toko awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā toko iwi, ko Ihu Karaiti toko ariki, ko Bruce Munro toko ingoa. I'm Bruce Munro. My roots are in Malaysia and in New Zealand, and foremost in Jesus Christ. I'm a husband, a father and a journalist. I battled severe anxiety for a decade, and I'm still mopping up from that lovely little episode. And I'm your moderator for this evening's discussion. A couple of quick items of housekeeping. The toilets are back out into the foyer and turn left, go down the ramp, don't go into the kitchen, that wouldn't be appropriate. And should we need to vacate the buildings in a hurry, please don't use the lifts, because we don't have any. Could you instead use the exits? There's one back through that door where you can see exit above there, there's an exit over this side, or back through the foyer where you came in. And lastly, can you just check that your phones are off? And as I say that, I'll check my own. This is the second of three public forums on important issues facing our community and our nation. How many of you were here for last month's forum on housing affordability? I see a show of hands. Oh, quite a few. My goodness. Well done. You're either very dialed into social issues or you clearly need another hobby. But seriously, we are delighted that every one of you are here this evening. We're going to be following basically the same format as we had last time. In a moment, we'll be welcoming up our panellists, and I'll be asking them some questions about what's going on with the nation's mental health and what can be done to improve things. Then we'll have an opportunity for some questions from the floor, so do be thinking about what you'd be like to ask that isn't being addressed from up front. At about 8:30, we'll be being joined via Zoom by Tim Butcher, who's the CEO of a faith-based trust that's been working in the mental health space in the Christchurch community for about 20 years. Then we'll be asking two politicians, Ingrid Leary and Michael Woodhouse, to respond to what they've heard this evening. And we'll close with a final opportunity for questions from the floor and a cup of tea. So, let's kick on. New Zealand is carrying a massive mental health burden. 1 in 5 Kiwis over the age of 15 are diagnosed with a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder. That statistic is high enough and bad enough, isn't it? But it's even higher when people themselves are asked whether they've had or whether they're experiencing mental distress. Then it goes up to 1 in 3. The number of people experiencing high levels of mental illness is increasing. And it's increasing fastest amongst young people. In 2012, 5% of 15 to 24-year-olds had high levels of mental distress. By 2019, that had almost tripled. And suicide continues to be a big issue, especially amongst males, youth, and Māori. Young people in New Zealand have the highest suicide rate of young people in any OECD country. And although the reality of New Zealand's mental health crisis has been acknowledged publicly, the crisis itself seems to be getting worse. At least that's my perspective. But we have some people here tonight who are much more involved in mental health on a day-to-day basis, and we're going to be hearing from them now. So panellists, can you please come up and join me, and I'll introduce you. The four of you, come on up, and I'm going to take a seat as well. Claire, let's start with you. Can you give everyone a wave so they know who you are? Excellent. Claire Ramsey. Claire is the manager of the Otago Youth Wellness Trust. Before that, she worked at the University of Otago and at Oranga Tamariki. The Otago Youth Wellness Trust provides support to rangatahi, young people with complex needs affecting their well-being. Jubilee Rajia. People away, excellent. Jubilee is a consultant psychiatrist. She works in private practice as well as working at the University Student Health Service and for the Southern District Health Board. Louise Roberts. I think you can guess which one's Louise out of the last two. Louise qualified as an occupational therapist in the United Kingdom in the 1980s, and she's worked in various mental health services ever since. For the past 17 years, Louise has worked at the Presbyterian Support Otago, where she's the manager of a community day service for people living with serious long-term mental illness. And David Bathgate. David is a consultant forensic psychiatrist working for the Southern District Health Board. He's also involved in training registrar psychiatrists and in undergraduate training. David has a special interest in autism and how that relates to identity, offending and mental health. Thank you all four of you for being here and being willing to be our panellists tonight. We appreciate the time you're giving and the insight and the experience you're going to be sharing with us. So thank you very much. So, to the questions. And Louise, let me ask you the first question, but we'll be getting everybody in turn to answer these questions. To set the scene, can each of you share a story from your experience that, for you, typifies the reality of mental health in New Zealand today? Louise, let's start with you. There's mics down there. Yep. Should be all ready to go.
Thank you. I want to answer this question by sharing a short story about a guy that I'll call Dave that I visited recently. He's quite a troubled guy and he finds communicating quite difficult, so we have quite long periods of silence interrupted by short, repetitive conversations. And it was during a period of silence that I sat and I looked around the lounge that we were in. We were sitting side by side on a window seat, and behind us was a very large window with a pair of curtains unevenly drawn. One on the right was quite sun-faded and shabby, and the one on the left sagged where the hooks had come off. On my right was a built-in bookcase that was empty, and on the floor in front of it were two of the big silver old-style televisions. Over on the left was a bookcase that had a few books kind of thrown on there, and on top of the bookcase was a very faded, shabby picture that was balanced on an angle where it looked like it had dropped off the wall because you could still see the hook and the black mark where it had been hung. And then in the corner was one of those white, what we would call a clothes horse, that you have a fight with when you're trying to put it into position. And it was thrown in the corner as though somebody had lost the fight. And I sat there and I looked around and I thought, there's no love in this room, there's no warmth in this room, and there's no care in this room. How is Dave supposed to get well when this is his environment? And here's the really sad punchline. I was in the DHB. There's an American activist in the mental health space that I brought to mind when I thought that. And she says our systems of care is an oxymoron. Systems don't care, people care. And it's time we put human back into our services.
Thank you, Louise. In fact, can you hand that mic, or can David grab that mic? David, can I ask you to talk to us now?
Right. I don't have such an exciting, well, I wouldn't call it exciting, but it's such an interesting story. I suppose what I've reflected on is really my experience of working in mental health for the last 40 years. So just to give a background, as Bruce said, I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I've done all my undergraduate and postgraduate training here in Otago, so I have had a vast exposure really to working with people with mental illness. I suppose the first thing is, as a psychiatrist, we're looking at and focused on supporting people living their lives as best as possible with mental illness. And mental health is broader than that. And I think hopefully that will come out this evening as well, that when we're talking about mental health, it's not just about illness, it's about our mental health, which is so important for each one of us, because it impinges on not just ourselves, our relationships with our families, our community, but also our physical health. So it's really, I think, a crucial aspect that often I think is neglected and people don't want to address. I suppose, I thank Bruce for the opportunity to talk this evening, because what it has done is the opportunity for me to reflect about what has happened and what has been developed with services. And I hear what people are saying, and you read the media, you think we're in dire straits from a mental health point of view. But I think if you look at where services come from over the last 40 years, there's been a huge development in mental health services. So when I started training, we were in the institutional era where those institutions were closing, and I don't think anybody would argue that hasn't been a bad thing, that those institutions had lived their time and there were issues with them and they needed to close. But also, I think there's been significant changes in the way we see mental health and the way we address that. So that's, developments both in the sort of treatments that we provide, so that's medications for people with major mental disorder, with quite exciting innovations in the type of medications available with significantly side effects, but also the development of the new psychological therapies, and particularly cognitive behavioural therapy, but also the development of what we call DBT, helping people around psychological issues, which is really important for well-being. The development of, when I started, there weren't specialist services. So, there were the institution and the inpatient services, and that was pretty well it. So we've had huge development in community-based services, but specialist services, particularly from forensic, people coming through the justice service, but also specialist regional services for mothers and babies, eating disorders, drug and alcohol, and also the expansion of services for people in the older age group with the change in population that we've had. And even the development of crisis service. When I started, there wasn't emergency psychiatric services. People ended up in the emergency service, A&E, and if there was a psychiatric issue, the registrar or consultant might get called to see them, but there wasn't a specialist multidisciplinary team. I suppose the other significant change for me as a clinician, particularly as a medical clinician, is the change in the model of care that we provide and understanding for people with mental illness. There's been a move away from a medical model to what we would call a social model. And again, I think that is a huge change in development. It's a move away from focusing on disease and disability and focusing on people's strengths and people's resilience. What is it that helps people manage and acceptance that recovery is not about just removing symptoms. People can live with their symptoms and still be recovered and have quality of life in the community. There's an increased recognition that as clinicians we need to listen to people who have lived experience. So I think again that's another development, particularly in the last 10 years, an acceptance that we need to listen to people who've gone through experiences of suffering from mental illness and how we can deliver services better, but also understand their journey, their pathway. But also a recognition that we need to listen to families, and there's that tension between often about human rights, autonomy, but also what families are really concerned about their loved ones as well. And being really privileged to be involved in that development of support for families dealing with people with major mental disorders as well. Also, just reflecting on that, government has played an important part. There's been, and most people are probably not aware of it, but the governments over the years have developed a number of national mental health strategies and plans, and they have had a significant impact on the development of mental health services, particularly secondary mental health services within New Zealand. And I think one of the things that's really been strong is the real focus on the whole issue of stigmatisation, because we know that that's been a major barrier for people coming into service or seeking help, is the whole stigma around mental illness. And I think that we can see that has significantly improved, which is something that's really important. I think looking at what's happening us in the southern region, I think one of the strengths we have is a stable but also dedicated workforce. We have, I think, clinicians, nurses, psychologists, occupational therapists and social workers, particularly in the secondary mental health service, who have been committed to working in our services over a long period of time. I think we do have a challenge, particularly around the bricks and mortar of the sort of services that we provide, and that's something we can talk about shortly. I think there's a recognition of the whole issue around primary and secondary health interface. And that's, again, not a new issue. That's been around for the last 30 years. And when I started as a community psychiatrist, that was an issue that we would continue to still work with even back then. And I think one of the big challenges particularly about the interface between primary and secondary healthcare is about the whole funding model as well, and how do we address that? Because secondary mental health services are free. If you go to your GP, it's cost, and there's a barrier to that. So not just mental health, but all health issues as well as that. So I think some of the issues that we have ongoing, and we will talk a bit more because you're talking about what's the issues that we're facing currently, is those issues around primary healthcare and resource. I think we've got good development, have developed good secondary services, but again, people accessing primary healthcare, particularly for mild to moderate disorders, has always been an issue, and the lack of resources around that. The issue around adolescence and youth services, I think, is an issue about young people, and we can talk a bit more about that. And I suppose the other big challenge in the southern area is just geographical distance. We cover such a wide area, and about delivering services close to home. Yeah.
Thank you, David. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to remind the panellists that we are looking for just a couple of minutes for answers. Claire, could I ask you to grab that mic here next? And
certainly, and that's a lovely segue, and thank you for mentioning adolescents and youth. I work at Otago Youth Wellness Trust. I'm not a clinician, I'm the manager of the trust, but in my work I'm there to advocate for and assist my staff as they find places for our young people and services for them, and it's nice to see some of our other colleagues in the audience tonight. We provide a therapeutic community-based service, and through that we see a lot of young people who are not accessing mental health services in the way that they need to, when they need to. And so the story from my experience, and this is a very recent story, is around a very young boy, he wasn't quite a teenager, who had some quite serious issues that came out with him being unable to contain his anger at home, and as a result his family was being hurt physically and mentally. He ended up in 9C here because there was not an adolescent bed available for him, and so for a week he sat at 9C with his mum supporting him because there were no adolescent beds available for a very high needs young man. In the end, he did get to Princess Margaret Hospital, which, as you know, is in Christchurch, so separated from his family at a time of really high crisis, but they did do some really good work with him, and now he's in a situation where he is getting the care and support that he needs. He's not home yet, but people are doing work with him. I've got lots of other stories around young people in this community who aren't accessing the care and support they need, and I'm not going to go on any longer except to say that in my old role at Oranga Tamariki, far too often the young people that I worked with there were rejected from the services because their issues were behavioural. And actually most of them suffered from some form of trauma which would create the behaviours that they were seeing, but I think that some of the clinician friends I have beside me may well say that that could also be a mental health issue. So that's a really big issue for some of the young people that I work with anyway.
thank you, Claire. And Jubilee.
Thank you, Bruce. I've written some notes, not because I don't know what I'm talking about, but just so that Bruce knows I'll keep to time. So I thought, rather than a typical case, I'd talk about a typical group of difficulties that we see. And many of you in the room might relate to this. Bruce already mentioned that you struggle with anxiety. I've had depression. So I want to talk about common mental health problems, anxiety and depression. And what tends to happen when we have anxiety and depression is that the symptoms of both can bring about big changes in a person's life. Their daily routines, their behavior and their ability to function is affected. And these changes in themselves make the depression and the anxiety worse. And I'm saying this because quite often you might have experienced it yourself or have family members who seem to be stuck in a vicious cycle of the depression, symptoms of depression and anxiety affecting a person's behavior and functioning and quality of life. And then that in itself causes more depression and anxiety, and so the cycle goes on. And this is really, really common, and the reason I want to bring this to this forum is that later on Bruce is going to ask us about solutions and what we can do perhaps as a society and a community. And I think for this group of people, and they are the largest group of those with mental health difficulties, there's plenty that we can do as a society, as family members. So.
Thank you, Jubilee. And from what I'm hearing you saying, we're talking about serious issues. We're talking about really troubling, heart-rending issues here in New Zealand, in Dunedin. So, Claire, can I ask you the second question to start off with? Looking at it from a big picture level, what do you think is driving or causing this crisis?
There's loads of things happening in society that impact on people's lives and how they cope with it. One of the things that we've seen is a huge increase in the number of young people suffering from anxiety. We also run the attendance service, which brings kids to school that aren't at school, and the number of times over the last 6 months that I've heard my staff talk about young people that haven't left their bedroom since COVID, since lockdown, has escalated. So we're seeing an awful lot of young people who are really struggling to cope with life, really, and what it gives to them. We're seeing a lot of young people who are stuck on gaming and their phones and that addiction to another world that's not real, which may well help feed what they're experiencing and their lack of engagement. Maybe the isolation is being fed by that as well. But I think that whole big picture, that the cause of the crisis, I couldn't tell you what's going on, except that as a society, are we looking after each other well enough? And I think Jubilee just talked really about that there. And given that we're starting to actually use wellness as a word that we look at, is it actually mental wellness that we should be thinking about rather than mental health? And would we actually turn things around if we looked at it in a different light?
Good thoughts, good questions. Yeah, Jubilee, can we hand that on to you? What do you see that is driving or causing what we have going on in society?
I'm preferring to call it a challenge rather than a crisis. And I think the challenge is that there are no simple answers, and we can be at risk of oversimplifying the problem if we jump on one thing or the other. But it's multifactorial, and that's why I think to see it as a challenge and to take responsibility for it as a community and as a society is really important. But I want to highlight what are the social determinants of health, because that's the basis from which other health issues can come up. And mostly the social determinants of health are the circumstances in a person's life that can affect their health, well-being, and their quality of life. And by this, we know, and I think the government is doing a lot about this as well, is the circumstances in the environment in which a person is born, in which they grow up, and Claire referred to young children, and in the environment in which we live, learn, work, and age. So we need to be thinking about housing, transport, issues of racism, inequality, and discrimination, and then the whole area of education, job opportunities, work, income, food, physical activities, the air and water. We're also needing to think about our climate, and language and literacy. So I want to place this very broad and say that there are challenges at every level, but we also need to be looking at what are the social determinants of health.
Right. Thank you. Yes, Louise. What do you see as a big picture level of what's going on, what's driving what's going on?
2 minutes?
Yeah, just
I ask that because I'm going to refer to somebody who spent 3 years answering this question, and that's Johan Hari. And he travelled to 39 countries and interviewed 200 people, and that's how long it took him to work out what the answer to the question was. In his book, he talks about how we evolved to live together in social groups, and how if you get separated from that group, you become distressed. For obvious reasons, you need to get back to the group and survive. He then goes on to talk about how he believes that we are now separating more and more from our social groups as people, and that the problem is disconnection. Not just disconnection from each other. He highlights 8 or 9, I can't quite remember, areas that we're disconnected. We're disconnected from each other, we're disconnected from nature, we're disconnected from meaningful work, we're disconnected from meaningful values. And so to him the answer is we need to start reconnecting all those things. I also want to mention, if reading's not your thing, just have a Google really quick snazzy video called How Smoked Salmon Destroys Our Minds. And George Monbiot talks about how the consumerist society that we live in and our constant absorption of marketing messages that we're not good enough creates what he calls an internal arms war, that we will never measure up and that we haven't got any self-worth, and that's what the market thrives on. So that's just a couple of people who are far more learned than me that you might want to follow.
Thank you, Louise. Yes, David.
Look, I would just reinforce what the previous speakers have already spoken of. What I've written down here is mental health is complex, there's no one factor, and one of the big issues in mental health, whether it's mental health issues, minor, major or serious mental disorders, we know that social determinants are really an important part to play, both in often related to the onset of mental illness, but also the pathway and the journey for people who suffer from mental disorders. I suppose that the two things I've reflected upon is I think if we look at the epidemiology studies, particularly for major mental disorder, the incident rate is probably much the same as it has been. I don't think that we've seen a significant increase, but we have seen a lot more, I think, awareness, and I think that is a reflection of the destigmatisation, and I think that's reflected on, high-profile people actually being open and honest, the fact that they've suffered from anxiety or depression. We've seen politicians, we've seen celebrities, we've seen professional athletes talking about mental health, and I think that's great news. I think we need to continue to destigmatise mental health and be able to talk about it. But I think also we need to recognise that there does seem to be an increase, particularly in our adolescents, in relation to the lack of resilience, or for whatever reason, and we've seen that in our crisis service, where we've seen, yes, there's been an increase in demand for crisis services, and I think that reflects what's happening for all crisis service, A&E, physical health care and mental health. But I think one of the striking things for me as a mental health clinician working in emergency service after hours, and I'm sure Jubilee would agree with me, is we're seeing a lot more young people present, where 5 or 10 years ago you wouldn't be seeing that age group coming in crisis into the emergency service. And if you look at the stats that we've collected from a DHB point of view, there is clearly a significant increase in that age group coming through. And I suppose that is one of the questions. I think there is no one single answer why, but there's definitely young people. There seems to be those issues around resilience. We can, I think, speculate and talk about, but yeah.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. I want to bring it down now to local level, and if we could start with Jubilee. David, if you don't mind handing that mic over there. Yes, so bring it down to local level now. Jubilee, what are you or your organisation doing to address the need that we do see all around us?
Excuse me, can I just ask you, Jubilee, to lift your mic a little bit more?
Thank you.
So, One simple answer to that, Bruce, is head down, beavering away, working at it. That's what
Right.
we do as an organisation.
Right.
Those of us who work for the DHB, the demand is huge, and the resources are not, are not enough. But I think most of us would say all we can do is head down and keep at it.
Right, okay, thank you. Louise, how would you respond to that question? What are you, your organisation, doing about this, the need that we see?
Well, I'd like to tell another little story,
Please.
if that's okay. It involves one of Jubilee's colleagues getting in touch with me a year or so ago. She was concerned about somebody that we both see. And this doesn't happen very often, so this is quite serious if somebody rings you and says, I'm concerned about that person. So we talked for a while. It was somebody we both knew really well. We both agreed that certain behaviours weren't really making sense. But whenever we asked, certainly whenever I asked, she had a standard answer that she said to me for years, don't worry about it, Louise. I'm not worrying, don't worry about it. So we couldn't figure it out. Until one day she came into the office and she said, she was with Francis, and she said, here's the problem. And in the way that people often are when they've experienced adversity, they're very kind, very generous and very considerate to others. And so she'd invited a homeless man to sleep on a couch. And he'd outstayed his welcome, he was violent and abusive, and she was frightened of him. The point of the story, and it alludes to something that David said earlier, is that she didn't tell me, and she didn't tell the nurse that works with Jubilee. She told the peer support worker. She told the person that knows, the person that's had lived experience, that's been there, done that, gets it. And it was the peer support worker that came and said, this is what you need to do. So traditionally, and again David's alluded to it, services were built by professionals who think they know. And we do know quite a lot, I'd like to think, but we've also got a blind spot that is people who really know, who've lived it. And we need to be including those people right across organisations at planning and delivering services and employing them as peer support workers to work alongside professionals. So that's what Presbyterian Support are doing. That's the journey that they're on.
Thank you, Louise. If you could give that mic to David. So, yeah, David, what would you say to that question?
Again, I suppose what I've reflected on is that there is no one factor. Mental health it's complex, and I suppose the two things that really, for me, importance of just reflecting again my journey as a clinician is just the importance of continuing to work on. And such forums as this, I think, is really great about destigmatisation, about people being open and being able to discuss about mental health issues. Because I think there's still stigma out there, and there's still reluctance for people to talk about it. I suppose the other thing I reflected on through my journey is just the real importance of the development of leadership within big organisations. DHB, district health boards, health's complex. It's a big organisation. And to make changes within that organisation takes time and energy and resource, but it also includes needs important around leadership. And it's about not just having somebody at the top telling people what to do, but the right sort of leadership, leadership that is developed and resourced and is able to prioritise what are the things that need to be put in place. Because again, health needs will always outstrip the resources that you have. And you have to make choices. You can't deliver everything to everybody, so you have to make choices, but it's also about advocating for the services that you think are really important. And as a clinician, I'm hoping that's what we do. We do advocate for the patients that we see, the resources and the services that we think are really important for them. And I think in mental health, that's always an upward battle. We feel often that we are the poor cousins in relation to when we're looking at health services. So that's something that I think is really important. The other thing was also around, particularly also just around primary health care and resourcing for primary health care, particularly for mild minor to moderate disorders as well. And again, I know the government have committed resources for that, but the reality is that does take time. You can't, it's not just about money, it's about having the people who've got the skills and the training to be able to put in the sort of supports and type of work, therapy that people need in relation to those disorders. So, which are, and it needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be shown that these interventions are effective. That takes time to happen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, David. Could you pass the mic down to Claire? And could I get you to pick up this mic that's feeling undervalued? And if the two of you could share that mic, then the two of you can share that one. So, Claire.
So, just picking up on what David said as well, we have a team that is multidisciplinary at Otago Youth Wellness. We've got social workers, teachers, nurses, occupational therapists and youth workers, which gives an amazing richness to the mahi that my team do. So our little example, I did find one, this is a really cool one because I've even been part of it or a beneficiary of it. What we've aimed to do, we've created a series of groups within wellness for our young people that they choose to join. And the goal is to help them understand or give them the knowledge that anxiety doesn't preclude them from being with their peers, from having relationships with their peers, from having friendships, and from being cared for. And so we've set up these little groups and they've morphed into something that the young people have created themselves really. But we have a Dungeons and Dragons group, which I still can't play. They have offered to teach me. We have a walking group, which in the winter time seems to be morphing into more of a cooking group. And so every week when the kids come in to go for their walk now, we get lovely cookies. We're all going to be fat by the end of the winter. But we've also created a whānau garden, and that might sound like a bit like everybody's got a garden, but what's happened with this garden is that a whole community around us, not just our kids, not just our staff, have been involved in developing it, and the kids are helping as well. So they've been out to the beach to gather seaweed, they've gone out to my place to get the bricks from the fireplace to build a spiral garden for the herbs. They've helped wheelbarrow piles of dirt and compost and other stuff that's been donated to us to build the gardens, and they are taking an interest in something that will become an edible garden, that they'll learn to cook, that they'll learn to understand how things work along the way. So we are seeing out of this, and we've got another group which started off as anime, and one of my board members is a policeman, and he went, "Oh, anime, Claire? It's a bit dark." And I said, "It's okay, we've got caseworkers." And then I quickly went back just to double check. We do have caseworkers, and what they've done, because the kids watch anime in their rooms on their own, and so they're bringing the good stuff out of anime, they're talking about it, they're talking about what they're learning from it, and then they're using art to express some of the stuff that they're learning from that. So it's a rich conversation that seems to come out of this. And one of the coolest things that happened is that we had a group in anime, and we had in that group someone who was very reserved and very shy. And one of the other girls, who was also in the walking group, said to this girl, "How about you come on the walk with us?" And she did. And so they're building their own little peer group, they're starting to feel more comfortable and confident with other people, and they're doing it through activities that are quite therapeutic, but actually they're having some fun, and there's a lot of laughter and a lot of, at the end of the day, do we really have to go home? It's 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, do we really need to go? So I think that's a really rich way for our young people to learn how to be with other people when they have been feeling incredibly alone and anxious.
Thank you, Claire. It's a two-part question about solutions. What is one key societal or attitude change, and one key national policy change that you think would make the biggest difference? David, could we start with you?
Well, you've only given me a minute, that's really tight.
Yep.
Look, the social change, and I suppose one of the important roles I have is around teaching medical students, and one of the things that often I like to, what I feel important to emphasise to them is the important skills of developing a relationship, what we call a therapeutic relationship. And that's engaging with the individual patient or client, or what do you want to say. That is a very fundamental aspect of healthcare as a clinician. And without that therapeutic relationship, really your assessment and your treatment is not going to go anywhere. So it's a really important skill. And I suppose as we reflect upon that, it's about having that trusting and respectful relationship. And that as individuals, we often think it's these issues are so big, how can we have any influence on those? But I think, again, as I reflect upon that, it's about the importance for each one of us about being mindful that connecting to people in healthy relationships does help us as our mental health, but also help other people in their mental health. And that's more than just being friends on social media. From a government point of view, it's about leadership. Again, I think that's really important. And it's about long-term vision. And again, I think there's always that tension from a government point of view. We have a 3-year election cycle. I think it's really difficult to get that long-term vision about how we see services and how do we prioritise the resources that we have available, because the needs will always outstrip that. But there's importance about supporting clinicians because they're a valuable resource, but ensuring they've got the right tools, that we've got the right sort of facilities to work in to support the people that we see, but having all the full gamut of supports, which includes hospitals and community facilities and that whole range of aspects of care for people with mental health issues.
Thank you. Claire, can I throw that to you now?
Okay, well, I'll just go on one thing, and I think what we have to do is work in a more integrated way, that we need to break down the silos, that we don't get stuck on bricks and mortar, and that the government actually, when they do funding, they do it in a broader way rather than in the silos that come through. And I've been saying that for 25 years, and I'll keep saying it. It's easy, but it's not.
Great. Thank you. Jubilee.
So,
And I'll keep you lift the mic right up.
yeah. The societal challenge, I think, is exactly this, what we're doing today, is to be sitting down together, thinking about what we can do and connecting. David's talked about that. And I just want to emphasize that social isolation and loneliness offer no buffer when there's stress and when there's life difficulties. And most of us would have experienced during the lockdown that for the first time we made connections with our neighbors. We smiled at each other when we went on our walks. And I think those are the things that as a society we need to recreate. And I just want to say very quickly that lack of connection and lack of community is shown to increase depression. And simple things that, like friendship, kindness, regular contact, practical help and support, going with someone or engaging people in groups or in pairs to do exercise, to have some intellectual stimulation, all of those things are known through networking to actually reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety. It engenders positive emotions, and it actually influences people to be more affirmative and positive in how they interact with other people. So I have 3 C's to say to all of us here in the room: connect, care, and contribute.
Thank you, Jubilee. Louise.
I think a lot's really been said. The social determinants and the way that we live in are huge issues that we're not going to solve in 1 minute or 2. But if I was to choose one thing that I think is tangible and measurable that we could do, I think it's to strengthen our workforce. Jubilee spoke earlier about being that busy doing the doing that it's very hard to look beyond that. And I see constantly staff that are struggling and burnt out. And I would see strengthening that workforce in terms of real support for them, training opportunities, supervision, and particularly pushing a certain percentage that's got to be a peer support network as well. I think we can really do that. I know we've got, if you're not familiar with HIPs, Health Improvement Practitioners, we've got 350 of those. Good start, but we really need more people that can help.
Thank you, Louise. Stay there for a moment, panel. So now's an opportunity for questions from the floor. Raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone. And because of time constraints, I've asked our panellists that only 2 of them answer each question. So if you have a question that you definitely want answered by a specific person, then please address that question to them by name. So, who's got a question that they'd like to ask?
Very quickly, perhaps 2 things. I would like to see patient involvement in delivery, and I look around, no disrespect to the panellists, but not necessarily any previous patient experience. But something I'd like to talk about in mental health, every time there's a big court case or a celebrity in court, there's often this theory that they suffer mental health issues. And while I'm sure that's true, I also think it's true that a lot of people say that almost as a sentence reduction thing. And I'd just like to point out that media-wise, we get really bad comment all the time about mental health issues, but thousands of people are like myself. We live with it every day. We don't commit violence. Overall, I'm not overly antisocial. And just what you think of that. That we'd like to see perhaps the media stories or any comment of it not being wrapped up in crime and celebrity behaviour.
Who'd like to respond to that?
I'll give it a go. I did raise this issue with Bruce about having a voice representative on the panel. Unfortunately, that was a time issue by the time we got to that stage. Certainly, if we repeated it, I'd be really keen to see that happen. In terms of what you said, I don't know, I would change it around. I can give you some insight into why I think it happens, and it goes right back to the days of the institutions when people were removed from society. And because they were removed from society, and we live in a democracy, we had to give a reason for it. So we had to create a narrative to justify removing people from society. And the narratives that we came up with, because we came up with 2, one was that they're a danger to themselves, and one was that they're a danger to other people. So you got a choice. There's a leader in the UK called Rachel Perkins, and she says, when you get diagnosed with a mental illness, you get a choice. You can either be an axe-murdering maniac, or you can be a dithering incompetent. And there's only those 2 extremes that we're realising. So part of the solution, and back to having things like this and talking and communicating with each other, is we actually start to build real narratives, not narratives that were made up a long time ago. Hopefully that answers a wee bit.
Yeah, look, I agree. I think it would have been ideal if we had a consumer or a person who lived experience on the panel, and I'm sure we'll reflect on that for the next forum. In relation to risk, look, I think we can't ignore that many of the people with mental illness do have issues of concern regarding risk, more predominantly risk to self, but sometimes risk to others. But how do we manage that? Well, one of the significant reductions of that is ensuring that people have all those psychosocial supports. So if you're looking at helping people reduce their risk to themselves or others, it's making sure that they've got an appropriate place to live. that they are socially connected, particularly suicide. We know that's really, really important. So it's about making sure that people are getting the right sort of care and support, and often sometimes that's not the case, and therefore we have a negative outcome. I think the issue around media, well, we could talk a lot about media, but I think that is human nature. That media just reflect society that we have, is that people are interested sometimes in negative outcomes or bad outcomes. And again, I think there is a responsibility, and media are aware of that, about responsible reporting. Most media do try and do that. Sometimes they don't. So they get it right sometimes they don't. Yeah.
Who else has got a question?
I wasn't expecting when I got the listener out of the letterbox today that it would be quite topical. But there's a major article on mental health by highlighting a book by Lucy Folks, who's an English psychologist, and I'd just like to read the question at the start of the article and invite you to respond. An influential UK psychologist argues we are increasingly medicalising anxiety and grief, and that experiencing negative emotions is a normal part of the human condition. And alongside that, the article also talks about the prominence given to people telling their mental health stories may have a downside. I'd just like to hear the panel respond to that.
I think Freud had a wonderful term for that. He called it the ordinary unhappiness of life. And, we cannot medicalize it. There's no pill for that. So it is true that often ordinary unhappiness of life is medicalized. But I'm wondering whether that happens because like I said earlier, loneliness and isolation means there's no buffer when those things happen, and then it comes on to health professionals to look after. Whereas as a society, maybe we're more disconnected than we ever were. Just thought that.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues particularly in New Zealand is the lack of psychological therapies available for people who have the minor to moderate difficulties with anxiety or depression. So you go along to your GP, and yes, if they've got or to have the resource and to be able to provide that resource, that's great. But often the other thing they can do is prescribe a medication, which, as you said, sometimes it's more effective to have the psychological intervention. So I think those resources need to be. And there's also the development of also just online resources now. But again, I think we can't rely on technology to get us around, because basically on many of the therapies that we use, it's that interpersonal interaction with people is so important. So it's about having the full gamut of resources available. But as I said, up till now, if you haven't got money to pay for it, you're not going to go and see a private psychologist or counsellor. They're expensive. So again, I think that's been a huge gap, which I think that we are hopefully addressing, but will take time to develop that sort of workforce.
Thank you. I think there's a question over here.
Just a quick question. Just wondering if the panel would think that a greater investment in the community sector to do the support work and the coming alongside people building community might help in reducing the number of presentations in terms of even the primary or secondary mental health system.
The answer to that would be yes.
And how much do you think they should invest in that sector? Not that I've got a vested interest at all, but...
I have to answer that question as well, Mike. How much should they invest? I'll give you an example. We have a contract for 100 kids a year, and this year we've done 276 through our service. That gives you an idea of the gap, and it's big. And the community-based services, I 100% support you because I am in one, but it's about what these guys have talked about, the connectedness and something that's close and easy, rather than having to escalate to a much higher end, much higher need service if we can get in early and do that work. And the HIPs are starting to be part of that, but there's an awful long way to go.
Are you familiar with Mary O'Hagan's Wellbeing Manifesto, From Big Psychiatry to Big Community? And so, yeah.
It's 3 people. I think the other thing is about working across sectors, because often what happens is we get so siloed. So people see it as, oh well, it's a justice issue, or it's a social issue, or it's a health issue. It's not. They need to all work together, and that's where you start getting this sort of people bouncing all over the place. There's the challenge.
Great, thank you. There's one question at the back there, and then I know I've got a question at the front as well.
Hi, my name is Megan Feely. Thanks very much for creating a safe space for everyone to come and speak about mental health. I'm an ex-Cadbury worker, and after the Cadbury's redundancy, I struggled with depression and anxiety, and it felt like I was on the edge of the banks of the river, and I fell into the river with my depression. And what I needed was someone to lift me up and keep me strong while I fundamentally start the healing process. And the Cadbury staff members were amazing, because it was a real community within inside the factory, a real family. And they were amazing, but there was something that was pulling me down the river faster towards the waterfall. And that was the bullying and the discrimination and the nasty behaviour from some people in this community. So to work through that, our Cadbury staff members, to try and figure out a way to try and heal and to get away from that negative, toxic environment, we come back together. We've joined back together to connect. And now what we do, we have a bit of a motto, and it's we don't want to stoop to the same level as those people, because bullying can, for me anyway, seeing this bullying that's happening in our country, it's creating a vicious cycle. Because when you get hurt, it's so easy to become bitter and negative and hurt by it, that then you become so bitter that you want to, almost you feel like you want to hurt people because you've been hurt. So it takes someone really strong to stand up and go, no, I'm going to stop this vicious cycle that's going on in this country. And when they go low, we're going to go high, and we're going to stop it. So for our staff, we come together and we actually raise money for mental health. So we raise money for I Am Hope and also Life Matters. And that keeps us lifted, and it's connection. And the team has started to laugh again, which is fantastic. And so just on the side of it with bullying and what happens in our community, and it feels like it's getting worse, and coming from that culture within Cadbury's and then going, the bubble bursting and then going outside, we had no idea how nasty it would really be out there. So just a question to you guys about bullying and what's your feeling on it, and any advice you can give to keep people lifted and stay resilient.
I think social media is destroying our community sometimes, when you hear and see what people are saying to each other behind that veil. And I think it's really sad that people then take that with them, and the hurt becomes real in their lives. I can't tell you how we get over that, except that as a community, maybe it's time we actually say enough's enough, and the kindness and caring that we need to show each other. And I think that we did it during lockdown. We talked about kindness, and we showed kindness to our neighbours, and we got to know people that we didn't know before. We've stopped doing it again, and maybe that's as simple as it is, that we actually show some humanity to each other. But I applaud you for not going down into the gutter. I've been supporting a friend through something like that right now, and the thing I've kept on doing is saying, do not go there, don't go down there, stay up here and be you and be proud of you.
Thank you. I think you were saying that, you as a group set out to do, to support each other and to be kind to others. And I'm reminded of a saying, be kind always, other people's wounds are invisible.
Thank you. And if we still have the mic around, Chris, here.
So, can you hear that? So I'm a little bit tempted to make a speech. It's very lucky they didn't invite me up onto the stand. I'm Chris Wisely, I'm a psychiatrist. And I think there are a couple of elephants in the room. I really like what you had to say about bullying. Every second person I see, the stories, I work in community psychiatry, they tell me about the horrific stuff that happens at schools. And we went to a course recently, Julie and I, where they talked about the term bullying in itself really is a minimisation half the time of what occurs, because if adults did what the kids do to each other, they would be incarcerated. And then when adults get incarcerated in this country, some of them are locked up for 23 hours a day all around the country. They don't get sufficient rehabilitation, they're not safe in there. Half of the ones locked up are there for drug offences. There's one thing I agree with Joe Biden about, it's that people who've got drug issues should get drug treatment. Every day you're hearing of murders. They mainly seem to be up in Auckland, but we have them down here as well. The elephant in the room is methamphetamine. Why do you think those people are getting murdered? And I can tell you it's not because of the effects of the drug. Those are the very rare, well publicised by the media, whoever commented on that. Most of it's about the money. And Johann Hari wrote another book called Chasing the Scream about drugs, and I'd suggest you all get hold of that and read the whole thing, because as a community, we've got to come to grips with this. If you're making masses of money selling methamphetamine, someone kills you, the next lot that come up are even more vicious and nasty, and they're making masses of money. And until we work out some way of stopping that, which may involve decriminalisation, same thing is to happen with alcohol and other drugs and gambling, that's going to keep going. And where you can make most impact, this is turning into a wee speech, I'll try to be no more than 2 minutes.
Do you have a question there, Chris?
I do, and I'm going to get to it right at the end. But at school,
10 seconds left.
0 to 4 is where you can actually put the rich environment in that stops people needing the drugs later. My question is to the psychiatrist. 30 years I've been doing the same job. The staff hasn't changed, the beds have halved, the workload has at least doubled. Do you have enough beds when you're on call to get the people who've bypassed everything else? Can you get them in when you need to these days? I know that's a bit provocative, but I'm just asking.
Well, I suppose, Chris, I've, like yourself, worked 30 years in mental health, and even when we had 3 times the number of beds, we still had the same issue of there were no beds. It's about how you manage your system, and it's not just about the beds, but it's about what are the supports in the community, and having all the different steps for people with patients with major mental illness be able to rehabilitate appropriately. And I think hospital beds are, in a crisis situation or an acute situation, it's really important to have a safe environment such as that for that intense treatment. But hospital is not the place that people need to be. It's about rehabilitation. They need to be living in the community. That's where your quality of life is going to be. So it's about having the full range, and how do you manage those very precious resources.
Well, I dread being on call, and thankfully he's my husband and he can do it sometimes.
Excellent. Please do.
I think you've raised a great issue, that it would be really good to have one of these about drug use and treating it as a mental health issue and not as a crime.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all those questions. And thank you, panellists. Let's give them a big round of applause. Welcome, Tim. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Bruce.
Excellent. Now I'm going to introduce you to the audience, and then we'll have some questions for you, okay?
Sure.
Great. Tim was a social worker and then worked in clinical leadership roles in the specialist mental health services at the Canterbury District Health Board. In all, he worked there for more than 30 years, until 2017, when he took up the role of Chief Executive at Stepping Stone Trust. And Stepping Stone Trust is a faith-based organisation connected to Musselburgh Baptist Church in Christchurch. The Trust has been providing community-based mental health services for 2 decades. It has a multi-million-dollar annual budget, it employs 140 people, and it's contracted by the District Health Board and the Ministry of Health, as well as providing other services. So, Tim, welcome. And first up, I want to ask you about what Stepping Stone Trust does. So, can you tell us what services do you provide, for how many people, and what difference do you see that the Trust is making?
Sure, thanks. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Great to be with you here from Christchurch. See the odd glimpse of the size of the gathering down there, so it's really heartening to see so many people with such an interest in our mental health and well-being and the state of that in society as a whole. So Stepping Stone Trust provides probably about 25 different types of services here in Canterbury. And so they're a mixture of residential, respite and community mobile services. And they are for youth and for adults. So in the adult realm, we have about 51 contracted beds for adults in the community. Probably 2/3 of those are long-term residential, and those people might be with us, could be 10, 15 or more years. Some of them are with us until their passing. A small few do get to graduate on to rest home care, but generally speaking, when it comes to mental health, it trumps age and eligibility for rest home care. So we have some of them with us for a very long time. Others in adult residential are much shorter periods of time, maybe 6 months to a year, as they journey towards a fuller independence and wellness to be able to maintain a quality of life in the community. And we also have 4 emergency housing beds for people who come out of hospital but aren't well enough to go into full unsupported independent living, but neither are they that unwell that they need a longer stint in our residential services. And then we have our respite services, of which there are 2 types. We have a crisis respite service, which is 13 beds. And those folk are referred by specialist mental health services, crisis resolution service or general practice, where it's an episode of unwellness or acute distress, where they might be with us for probably on average 3 or 4 days before they can return home. And then we have a planned respite service, and those folk are generally referred by their GPs. They can be allocated up to 28 days a year of planned respite. That's often around supporting them through anniversaries of traumatic events, or it might be after some aspect of therapeutic care where they need some ongoing support. And then in the youth area, we have a youth residential service with 12 beds and a youth respite service, which co-resides with the youth respite service. That's 1 bed, but the ratio between residential and respite can fluctuate. And then in the community services, with youth, we have 3 or 4 areas of service delivery. We have a general community support work team, which is about 5.5 FTE of staff. And we have an intensive youth mobile service, which has about 5 FTE of staff. They are clinical staff. And then we have our Carol and Reed Family Support Service, which supports children and youth whose parents have a mental health diagnosis, and we support the whole family, but particularly the children. And with that, we have activities and events and camps and education groups to help them share with each other and to understand what's happening in the lives of their parents and get some mutual support and some education and some time out. Then we have, still in the youth area, a worker who is a specialist in alcohol and drug issues. That person works closely with our specialist mental health CAF service, which actually all of our services do in youth. So that person works in the CEP or coexisting problem area and supports young people where mental health is the primary diagnosis, but they also have a significant alcohol or drug substance abuse issue. We have several collaborations going on. A particular one is what we call Manu Kareri, which recently received some additional funding. And that's a joint venture with two other providers here in Christchurch, a kaupapa Māori provider, Purupuru Whetū, and an alcohol and drug specialist provider, Odyssey House, and together the three of us were a core in that, and we've now recently brought in 5 other providers so that we can cover Ashburton, Rangiora and those outer lying areas of Canterbury, and others with a specialist area of interest such as 298 Youth Health Centre. You might be well aware of Sue Bagshaw, who's often on the news in the youth space, so a service that she started. So there were several providers that worked together to provide that service across Canterbury, and that's really a brief intervention clinical service for young people. And then in the adult community space, we have just over 14 FTE of staff, and in addition to the general work that they do, we run a more specialist group work program called Mindwise, which helps adults who are grappling with significant emotional dysregulation, putting themselves at risk through self-harm or suicidal behaviour. That's a group program, again a joint venture. We're a fund holder for the Canterbury District Health Board, and we have clinical workers from about 4 other different providers in Christchurch who contribute facilitators to help run that program. We also have a mobile medication service where we support about 60 people living in the community whom we visit once or twice a day to their home, and just ensuring that they take their correct medication on time. And by doing that, we actually support them to stay out of hospital, to stay well on a medication regime, and actually have quite a good quality of life. So it's a very cost-effective support program. We're also involved, one of the panellists was talking about the health improvement practitioners, health coaches and support worker model, the primary integrated mental health and addictions workforce, which is part of the rollout of the government's $1.9 billion investment in mental health. So we're involved with about 5 other providers in Canterbury who provide those roles to support general practice in that space. There are probably other things we do, but that's certainly the bulk of them. Thanks, Bruce.
Okay, that's certainly quite a list. Do you have a figure on how many people, how many clients you're involved with, and really interested to hear what you see of some of the difference that the Trust is making?
We generally estimate that we're working with between 500 and 600 people at any given point in time on a weekly basis. That includes across the community and in our residential services. In terms of the difference we're making, just one other area of, a few other services I should mention that are quite significant. One is our new Reframe Wananga service. Now this is a co-designed hybrid service for young people, by young people, co-designed with young people who have their own lived experience of mental distress, where this is a relatively new initiative, less than a year old. And we're delivering that in schools and in city libraries and various other locations. So that's got its own website, reframewananga.org.nz. That's a pretty exciting new initiative, and that's part of the overall Manukariri initiative. So we have 1.5 FTE of staff invested in that. And our planned respite service for adults that I mentioned earlier is also a peer-led service. So this is running to an intentional peer support model. We train our staff in that, and it's quite a different way of doing things. We only employ people with significant lived experience to be staff in that service. And we also have our Barnett House Recovery Centre, which is a new initiative, quite significantly different, very focused on mutuality, on learning and giving and receiving and learning about life. So in that location, we have people with lived experience and caregivers and professionals who help them, all in a co-learning environment. Sometimes they're the teacher, sometimes they're the receiver, and we have an adult recovery college, which is partly online as well. And that also is a joint venture delivered by people with lived experience and professionals working together to deliver that program. And then at the Recovery Centre, we've got garden groups, we've got art groups, we've got knitting groups, cooking classes, all sorts of other initiatives going on there. So, with all of those initiatives, including Barnett House and the recovery colleges, it would be well over 600 a week. Some of the online programs that we've done, we've had over 50 or 60 people attending those. On one occasion during lockdown, we had people from as far away as Los Angeles joining us, which wasn't the intention, but that's got a real reach. And surprisingly, people form really effective online communities with these sorts of platforms. So that's really effective. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Can you tell us about how the Trust got started, and can you also tell us a couple of things that have been key to your success? And lastly, what would be your advice to a small group of people if they were wanting to respond to mental health needs that they saw around them?
Sure. Stepping Stone Trust started in the early 1990s. At that time, there was a massive wave of deinstitutionalisation in providing psychiatric care at that time. There were hundreds and hundreds of people in psychiatric hospitals, including what was then Sunnyside Hospital here in Christchurch, now called Hillmorton. Hundreds of beds were closed at that time, and people left hospital and went into the community, but very little had been put in place to support them in the community, and people were left floundering significantly. I mentioned, or did I, our Carolyn Reid Family Support Service. Yes, I did. Carolyn Reid was the wife of the founder of Stepping Stone Trust. The founder was Graham Reid, and actually the year before last he was given a Queen's Service Medal by Patsy Reedy, Governor General, in recognition of the work that he did in establishing a number of things in the mental health space for support. But Graham was a member of then Musselburgh Baptist Church, now Southwest Baptist. And Carolyn, his wife, had a very severe bipolar disorder, and she was in and out of Hillmorton a lot. And when those beds were reduced significantly, there was just no support for her or the family. And they had 2 young boys, and the whole family was floundering. He had to stop work, they had very little income. Pretty difficult situation, and he lobbied the then management of the Specialist Mental Health Service and the council and Housing New Zealand, who and over a period of time was given a house by Housing New Zealand to operate a day program for people really grappling with severe mental distress. And that's how it began, and we grew from there. That formed a trust in 1994. That's now more than 25 years later that we are what we are today.
Are there a couple of things that you feel like have enabled what you've done or been key to being able to make a difference?
It primarily comes down to staff. There's an adage in any employment sphere, really, employ for attitude, train for skills. And originally all the staff who were employed by Stepping Stone Trust were Christians, and that's no longer the case, but certainly people do support a very strong Christian ethos in the organisation. But certainly people with a real caring heart and compassion and a degree of long suffering and just a real heart for people who are suffering, who are teachable. I think those are the primary things. Initially, people started off with a good heart but didn't necessarily have any professional skills or capability at all. And certainly the Trust has invested a great deal in training staff and employing staff. And we have many staff who could earn a great deal more in other fields. We've got a couple of staff with PhDs who work as support workers. Many of our support workers, the majority by far, have a health qualification, but work for us just enjoying a different model, a different way of working and the ethos of the organisation.
Excellent. Can I ask just briefly, what would be your advice to people if they were seeing needs around them and they wanted to respond? Just briefly, what would you say they should do?
Well, I think one of the other things we do is deliver the Mental Health First Aid course, which is an international program that's been taught to over 4 million people in over 25 countries around the world. I'd really encourage people to start maybe by getting some education and some understanding about specific mental disorders, how they present and so forth. I think working to challenge stigma in society, as one of your panellists mentioned, and there's another one mentioned, actually working to address some of the social determinants. And I think you had a forum a few weeks ago on housing, and I think actually stable housing is one of the strongest things that we can do to help people's well-being and mental state, if we can stabilise some of those fundamentals in life. Figure out where you want to start. There are a lot of big questions. Some initial training. I think trauma-informed care, becoming aware of that. There's a saying, don't ask what's wrong with you, ask what's happened to you. A lot of these people have a story, but by the grace of God, go we all, really, and have had some very traumatic experiences and need our support and compassion. But actually being available to live in community with them and support them on their tough journey.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for joining us tonight. Can we show Tim our appreciation? Well, I hope you're finding this thought-provoking and informative. We have one more element to this evening's discussion. The political aspect of New Zealand's mental health crisis has been in the news recently, again. So it's good that we have two politicians here this evening to give us their take on things. And when they've done that, there will be an opportunity to ask questions from the floor. So can I ask Michael Woodhouse and Ingrid Leary to come on up, please? Welcome to you both. Thank you for being willing to be here this evening. There's a mic each there. Ingrid Leary is the Labour MP for Tairi. In Parliament, she sits on the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, as well as the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committees. Prior to Parliament, Ingrid was an international relations specialist, a lawyer, parliamentary press secretary, university lecturer and award-winning broadcaster. She's also a fellow of the Rosalind Carter Mental Health Journalism Centre. And Michael Woodhouse is Dunedin based and he's a National List MP. He held several portfolios while in government. In opposition, he's been national spokesperson on a variety of subjects, including housing and health. He's shadow leader of the House and is national spokesperson for finance and transport. Before entering politics, Michael worked at Dunedin Hospital and at the ACC, and then he spent 7 years as the Chief Executive of Mercy Hospital here in Dunedin. Welcome both of you, thank you for being here. Michael, can I start with you? What's your experience of mental health issues personally or for people that you know?
I guess, like all of us, you don't get to sort of my slightly older years and have a family as large as I do without experiencing some connection with mental health, mostly low-level anxiety and depression issues. But I have been quite fortunate, I think, that my own sort of immediate family have not been had experience of poor mental health. But as an MP, I guess, also we come into contact with people for whom either their situation creates mental health issues or their mental health issues create situations like housing problems or justice issues and so on. I had a very profound experience only 3 or 4 months into my time as a Member of Parliament where there was a risk of self-harm to a constituent that we didn't act on as promptly as we could have, and that didn't have a good outcome. And that resulted in a significant change in the way we thought about and reacted to issues coming through our office, that I'm lucky enough to have the same staff 12 years later. And we learned a great deal from that, and we continue to use that learning every time we interact with people who come through the door who either are there because of their mental health issues or have that as an allied challenge.
Thank you, Michael. What about for you, Ingrid?
Yeah, it's been quite a big part of my life. So my grandfather committed suicide, and in my immediate family and extended family we have quite significant experience with bipolar, type 1 bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And also going back into my dad's family with anorexia nervosa before it was really very common at all, so not like the scourge that we see now, but in a time when it hardly existed. So I've had a big interest in mental health issues when I was a journalist, which is what led me to the Carter Centre Mental Health Fellowship, which was really an opportunity, real privilege to go to the States to the Carter Centre Institute, which is run by Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter, and it brought together journalists from around the world with leading psychiatrists. And one of the big focuses really was actually on how can we destigmatise and the role that the media has to play. So I'm going a bit off tangent here, but in terms of the question about the media before, I accept that there's a very big issue around stigmatisation that's been perpetuated by the media through the hero-villain paradigm that media reports things on. So, you know, it's very black and white, people are heroes or villains, and 9 times out of 10 the villain is the person who's different, or if they're a celebrity then it could be that they are leaning on that excuse. So mental health has been a big issue. I have sectioned somebody in my own family twice under Section 12, which was difficult, and I'm very interested in in 2 relationships. One is between mental health and addiction, which we've talked about tonight, and the other one is around mental health and incarceration, And I think we have to have a very, very big national discussion about that and about the support systems available both for those who are incarcerated and those who are out on parole and are probably in a very similar situation to what was described before, which is when institutions were shut down and people left on their merry way with very little support. That's exactly what we're seeing now in terms of our criminal justice system.
Thank you, Ingrid. And can I stick with you actually for a moment? What's something that you've heard tonight that has surprised you, if anything?
Nothing's surprised me, and I have lots of little notes that I've recorded about things that I'd love to be able to sort of bounce off some of the ideas that have been raised. What I was heartened to hear was the level to which people are suggesting that we need to completely decriminalise drug addiction. Because we've had a national conversation around cannabis, and the logic to me would suggest that that leads to a broader conversation. Now, I have an absolute pathological hate for methamphetamine. My family has experienced the damage that can be caused by it, but so I'm all for stopping methamphetamine being imported or sold. But for those who are in the grips of methamphetamine or other addictions, I absolutely agree that we need to see that as a health issue, and I'm really heartened to hear psychiatrists this evening saying the same thing.
Thank you. And for you, Michael, how are you reacting to what you've heard tonight?
I'm a bit relieved actually, because I was worried that the answer to the question being no might have sounded sort of a bit arrogant, but like Ingrid, there have been some great anecdotes that I hadn't heard before, some reading that I've got to go and do around particularly social connectedness, although I have to say my mind casts back 21 years to first reading Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which I think was the first really major seminal work at a meta-analysis level about the degree of social disconnectedness in our community. And if we think about that being 2000, I think it was 99 or 2000, that was pre the widespread use of internet, pre use of phones as ubiquitous devices in our lives, and the use of those devices as a bullying tool, particularly for our young. So if there was a degree of social disconnectedness in 2000, boy, I think we've seen a generational journey that has created the tinderbox for the sorts of adolescent mental health issues that we're seeing exploding now. And I'm really been very interested in the work of Professor Mark Wilson from the Victoria University and our own multidisciplinary study here in Dunedin about the issue of emotional regulation, or emotion regulation, and how those two things interact. But I am, I guess, an affirmation of the scale of the problem from people who are working in this area every day, an affirmation of the calibre of the people that we have in the South working in mental health and addiction services. I think we're tremendously lucky, because I know that our 4 panellists are indicative of a highly professional group, and I worry that actually none of us are getting any younger, and that our health workforce planning, particularly mental health, is going to be a growing issue. And an affirmation, I think, that science and models of care are the prevailing driver of change, not political narratives. I think we've seen a bit of that over the last 3 or 4 years. Perhaps some would say too much of that. But I am encouraged by the recommendations of the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry, somewhat frustrated at the pace of change, but that has to be driven by the sector and by science.
Can I just add to that I think there's an interesting language around how we frame a lot of these issues, and we've talked about medical models and social models, and I think we're getting to a level of maturity in our country where we can actually start to have a real conversation about the convergence between spirituality and mental health. And I don't mean that in a religious sense. When we're talking about the word connection and disconnection, to me that has a spiritual dimension. If we're using a Māori paradigm, we could use a less kind of a controversial word just to say connection and disconnection, but they're very big concepts about what do we mean by connection and disconnection. When we look at things like capitalism based on profitability and the specialisation that people have had, where they become a very small specialised player in a big situation in work, there's something to be said for the value of feeling part of something bigger. You know, what is your purpose when you go to work? You might be going to work in a finance role in a big, a widget factory, but unless you feel some belonging to the mission of those widgets or some kind of meaning in your work, then that is part of, I think, of the disconnection. So some of the issues that have been raised to me really question at the way that we run our society, how we run our economic values. Somebody said, let's talk about mental well-being rather than mental health. Well, the government is framing all of its work in terms of well-being, and that is around addressing some of the social determinant factors. So I know I won't go on anymore, but I think that the questions that have been raised this evening are really, really big, and they are expressing themselves in where we see people falling through the gaps, which is what we call mental unwellness.
Thank you. So Michael, can I ask you then, at a political level, what do you see that needs to change?
A couple of things, and it was touched on by the panellists. So I think somebody, might have been you, David, who referred to it as the poor cousin, psychological medicine, mental health more generally. And I think we are some way away from seeing mental health as equivalent to physical health. And if I presented with acute symptoms if I break my leg on the rugby field on Saturday, I'm not going to be given a referral to a psychiatrist in 8 weeks' time or an orthopaedic surgeon in 8 weeks' time. But if I have an acute mental health event that may be first onset or a relapse, it appears to me that we treat that entirely differently. We need to normalise that, and Ingrid's talked about the destigmatising of mental health. We've got a long way to go, and I think politicians and public policy can help that quite considerably. The second thing is, and funding will never be out of this conversation, but the hardest position to be in the health sector, in any public sector, but definitely the health sector, is in an area where the model of care has changed or the service has been elevated from where it was a couple of generations ago, because our funding and planning is very much a cost-plus mentality. And it's incredibly difficult to get the attention of the health funders to say, now is the time to do this. And the first thing a health funding person will say is, well, okay, what are we not going to do? And suddenly you're in a contest, a zero-sum game, which is a very, very difficult place to be. And we see this not only in mental health, we see it in palliative care. We see it in some of the new disease management that we have coming through. Drug treatments, new drug therapies, obviously, Pharmac's been quite a bit in the news over the last 2 or 3 years. And so one of the things that we've got to do is be brave. But we've also got to be scientific, because one of the things that people say is, well, if we invest in this part of the spectrum of care, we'll save money over here. Well, we've got to stop using that money, that term save money, because you're never going to do that. Actually, there's a bow wave of need that the best we can do is blunt it. But that doesn't make the case for investment in the sort of community cares that this gentleman over here was talking about less important. So that's where we need the bravery. Now, as I say, the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry recommendations, I think, are a really good start. The government has committed quite a bit of money to it, and there is a sense of frustration within the sector, and I think from the government, that it's not being deployed as quickly as we can. Workforce is a barrier, that's understood. I think we've got to think about the quantum of our existing workforce and how we change it, but the model of training is a guild model, really. David will have a registrar and he'll train in the way David was trained, and the next generation basically does it with a little incremental difference. But actually we've got to see whole new roles now emerge. And that actually isn't politician-led, but it is politician-enabled, and I think we've got to accelerate that process.
Thank you, Michael. Ingrid, at a political level, what needs to change?
I agree with Michael on everything he said. I think that somebody said earlier this evening about the government not working in silos, and at the risk of repeating my comments at the housing hui, I think the challenge for any government is to be putting money into prevention rather than into responding. How does one get to that point? It means actually having to put values onto items like, or factors like, longevity of housing, consistency of schooling, and so on. How do we then transfer the value of that across to another government agency so we can say, because we've kept this child in this house for 12 years, we know that, blunt tool, we have saved X number of dollars on medical care, on education, and therefore we are going to continue to fund this thing that on the face of it doesn't look like an intervention but is actually providing a whole lot more value for money than anything that we do when we respond. And I absolutely believe that. It's the same in anything, whether you're talking about mental health, whether you're talking about, supporting children with fetal alcohol. We've got 40,000 of those in New Zealand. If the care and prevention is put in at the front end, then everybody is better off. And it's not just those who are experiencing the mental health, it's the ripple effect into their families. I know that all too well. It's the support for the children and so on. So I don't think it's a political issue. I think the other element to this is that we need to, and some of this came out in the conversation tonight, is we really need to recognise as a society that the idea of family has fundamentally changed. We don't really know what a family is anymore, and I think in the future we will be looking at that around financial social support. We need to, because there's some very unfair things that are happening to those who either need to receive money to look after children or need to pay money. But what we do need to know is that it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to look after each other. Those resiliences and the confidence that families used to be able to instill in their children may or may not be there, so it's up to each and every one of us to provide that confidence in whatever sphere we can. And that's why we need to be nice at work, have activities, don't bully, the things that just make good families. We need to start acting like a family.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you for answering my questions. I want to give an opportunity now for you to answer some questions from the audience. Who's got the mic, Greg?
Hi, I'm Ilka Bakehouse. I'm one of the elected members of the Southern District Health Board. I just wanted to make a comment first about something you had said, Michael, about mental health being the poor cousin and not equivalent to physical health. And something that I've recently encountered was if we could start thinking of mental health issues as the same as cancer, in that it can affect anyone and it can be terminal. I think that then we'll get to that point where it will start being equivalent to physical health issues, and I think that's an important thing we need to get to. Now, I'm a young member of the health board. I've just only had one term, and I've been shocked from the beginning of my time with the health board with the amount of health and safety issues with staff members, particularly in one unit, which I will not name, and I'm very concerned that this is going to be a huge issue. We have just commissioned a review of our own mental health issues up at Walkery, and one of the comments made by one of the staff members involved was that there's so much red tape, so much reporting, and all these red tape that is preventing them from doing their actual work. And it's clear to see, but my concern is with the health reforms that are happening next July, and we're all merging into Health New Zealand, what assurances can you give us that this isn't going to be we're not going to be lost in this huge bureaucratic red tape nightmare?
Right. Okay, three really big issues that I'll try and answer as quickly as I can. Firstly, the comparison between mental health and cancer is right, but not for the reasons that I don't believe it's for the reasons that you gave. The two reasons I would, because the best advice that I've seen, certainly when I was in government, when Peter Gluckman was the Chief Science Advisor, is that cancer is curable. Science will beat cancer and it will become a chronic condition. The things that stop us is knowledge and money, but we're getting there. And so actually in that way it is kind of comparable. There could be a chronic condition where you have a relapse and a recovery, and that's certainly what mental health is like. The other way that it's similar is because I think we know now how to prevent cancer. We know the lifestyle changes that we need to make, not smoking, not drinking to excess, a good diet, and one or two other things. I think to some degree, we can do the same with mental health. But we talked about determinants tonight. Social, environmental, perhaps pathology as well. Once we better understand that and we normalise it in the way that we've discussed tonight, I think we can prevent a lot of the early onset. Bear in mind that half of all people who live with mental health have their first experience before the age of 14. Mm-hmm. Bullying thing is a really big issue, and it exists in every organisation, but for some reason healthcare and the stress that goes on, particularly with acute care, emergency care, acute surgery, that really high into EPS, that really high intensity environment. And it existed at the hospital that I ran. We were very proud of the culture that we had there, but we weren't naive to the fact that it would happen. It's not the only organisation. Ingrid and I work in a place that has had quite a bit of attention paid to the pugilistic and potentially bullying environment that exists. I've not been exposed to it to any degree, really, but I've seen it. The third issue, I share that concern. But it's not just about the current reforms. I think we've got to view this as a longitudinal move from probably the early 1980s, maybe the late 70s to now, that has increasingly managerialised healthcare, and I would like, and we work actually quite hard to return decision making to clinicians, but with that autonomy and that control goes some responsibility as well for the best deployment of limited resources. And so there's a quid pro quo to that.
I'll just answer quickly on the element of bureaucracy, and also actually just in terms of the frustration that actually, some people have felt around the rollout of mental health services, and even I believe the Health Minister was saying to get on with it, and the Prime Minister said today, we really are creating a primary health care mental health service that hasn't really existed in New Zealand because it's always been dealt with at the secondary level to a degree. So that's part of that. I think around the bureaucracy, the challenge, we can see very clearly that the model which came from the UK and was probably fit for purpose for a bigger population isn't fit for purpose for New Zealand, and there is a huge amount of duplication. I think you've quite rightly given the challenge of how do we ensure that we can push out the resources to where they're needed, and there is a very big focus on primary healthcare, as there should be. I think there's lots of science to show that any bureaucracy has certain gates. I think it's something like 21 people, 80 people, other levels where they start to feed on themselves. So having the resource at primary healthcare level, I think, is the answer. And what I would personally like to see is far more social enterprise models where there are contracted relationships. I think the Belclutha Medical Centre is a really good model of a social enterprise that works really well, and a lot of the community organisations that have been represented tonight, including the Christchurch one, driven by people who have social profit motivation and who also have that degree of autonomy because they're not working for a risk-averse government organisation. They have some ability to innovate and an appetite for risk, and they are allowed to do that because they're at arm's length from government ministries.
I just want to say this has been really good for my mental health. To come along here tonight and hear two people from two different political parties speak with respect and show respect to each other, I'm going to go away from here feeling a lot healthier than I came. Thank you. Well, I appreciate that feedback.
it happens far more often than you would believe if you watch the 6 o'clock news. Even at the moment, we would support probably more than half of the legislation that the government is putting through. Might have a flick at them along the way, but I think in the engine room of democracy is actually the select committees, and Ingrid and I sit on the same select committee on a Wednesday. That's Finance and Expenditure Committee, and I think you're a better one actually to answer this, but were you surprised at the degree of kind of cooperation in the committee when you came into it?
I think it was interesting to come in and to sit and wonder how it was going to play out, but I think during the select committee process you get a really good idea of the level of intelligence and thoughtfulness and preparation and respect that people bring into the room. And so however the relationships play outside of that room is probably an indication of what they've fathomed looking at those 4 elements.
Yes, who's got the mic at the moment?
A message for the Leader of the Opposition, Michael.
A Nostradamus-like faux pas, who knows?
Basically, I've lost the message on the phone, but I asked my friend the other night. But anyway, what would you do what would the Leader of the Opposition do to change the situation where I was a psychiatrist for over 10 years? And there's evidence that there's a lot of good agencies happening in Dunedin and other towns, but would it be a good idea to have free counselling agencies in Dunedin and the surrounding areas? So it's just that it costs, I'm a beneficiary, and it costs about
$70 a lot
to get 1 hour's counselling.
And you'll have seen the frustration that a mental health advocate, Mike King, has expressed at the inability to be able to get the very sort of primary community care contracts that he thought was going to be made available through the mental health and addiction inquiry and the extra money that was available. So that's one thing. Yes, it does have to be, the cost barriers have to go. The other two things, and we campaigned on these last year, although nobody was really reading policy from the National Party last year. There was a lot of it, but you probably couldn't name a single one. The first is to really get in under the bonnet of a model of care that West Australia are using right now, is the stepped care model, which is, and there's other parts of the world that have variations on this. But basically, what I see, and Jubilee, Chris and David are better able to confirm or refute this, but it seems to me that in the post-deinstitutionalising period, we still see a lot of people with chronic mental illness who have acute exacerbations of their condition. They are admitted into secondary care, either a ward or some other level of secondary care. They're made better and then they're sent back out into the community, and there's very little support for them. And so the step up, step down model is a way of making sure that that's caught back into the community, and the outcome is probably, we hope, we expect, is a less likelihood and a less frequency of need of secondary care. The second thing, and I think Tim discussed psychological first aid, I think there's a really big opportunity here for us, or particularly our young, to understand the signs and symptoms of distress, anxiety, depression, addiction, and to check in and make sure that our loved ones are all right. And so we invest quite heavily in that psychological first aid, because then that whole team of 5 million actually really starts to ramp up, I reckon.
And the government has put quite a bit of money into counselling services at schools. We do recognise that catching it early is the best, gives the best value for money and the best outcomes for those young people at a pivotal time in their life. As far as the Mike King program goes, the facts around that are that they were late with their application. The Prime Minister has been careful today not to say that we won't look at it. She hasn't indicated either way. What she has referenced, though, is maintaining the integrity of the tender process, because there are also the bigger pictures to think that you've got to have a process that has integrity. So I would say on that one, no promises, and I have no Nostradamus powers, but I would say watch the space. I'm hoping that if it is a good program and is worth doing, that we will find a common sense way through.
Mike's, I got to know Mike over the last 3 or 4 years. He's a hard guy to love, but you've got to admire his passion and his commitment to the cause. And I'm very hopeful process won't get in the way of doing the right thing.
We've got one more question at the back there.
From both political parties, what are the main agreements between you both parties, and what are the main disagreements?
Generally?
Is there any
mental health space?
Yeah.
You can go first.
I think that we have we seem to have a very different approach to 2 areas that I've said that I'm very interested. One is around incarceration and the relationship with incarceration and mental health. And the reason I say that is because we're looking at proposals by, for example, members of the opposition who want to do things like have a new class of crime that would occur if somebody who was having a mental health crisis or not were lashed out at, say, a St John ambulance person or a police officer and so on. So that's one area where I feel that we are taking what I would call more of a health response rather than an incarceration, but I'm sure Michael will possibly counter that. The second one is probably around drug reform. We get told we're soft on crime or soft on drugs. I think you will find much more sympathy from the current government around looking at how we can try and fix the drug problems by taking a much more socially orientated and health orientated approach. And the reason for that is not because it's a nice thing to do, it's because we haven't cracked this one for the last 100 years. So what makes, we need to try something different.
Well, firstly, we're not the party that wants to jail you for 3 years for what you say. That's the Labour government. And actually, I think that the important issue here is offending and reoffending. A serious crime does require a punishment that reflects society's opposition to it. It has a punitive aspect, it has a rehabilitative aspect, and it has a deterrent aspect. That's effectively what incarceration does. Yep, we want fewer people in prison. Absolutely, that's 2 places we will agree. We want less offending. And so that's a segue actually into that second side. I think it's really important to distinguish between marijuana as a drug and whether it should be decriminalised, legalised or kept unlawful. And for the record, I would have supported decriminalisation. The scourge of opioids and methamphetamine, and actually not so much the drug use, but the behaviour and the crime and the neglect that goes along with that, and the carnage that it's causing families and communities, means that I can't agree with Ingrid right now. And 10 years ago, my brother's a police officer. 10 years ago I asked him, what's happening in the meth scene in Dunedin? He says, not much, Barrel. And maybe a little bit of Wanaka, Queenstown, but we're not seeing it down here. Now it is rife and it is destroying our communities, and I don't believe that simply taking a health approach, even if we took a health approach to that, I would say, well, is the health of New Zealand is better, worse or the same if we legalised all drugs? And I can't say that it would be better or say the same right now on the evidence.
I have to say also, it's not government policy to legalise all drugs. I think it's an area that I'd be really interested in investigating because of the logic that goes with the legalisation argument around cannabis. I agree. I have a pathological hate for methamphetamine and what it does. I think it steals people's souls. I think the people we need to go after are the peddlers, not the users. And the other thing around hate speech is just, I think that, we won't get into the hate speech argument because it's a different debate. However, there is a mental health element to hate speech, and I think the debates that we will have, that we're both looking forward to having in Parliament, is a really good national debate. It's really about where do you draw the line, because we already have hate speeches. We have new social media platforms and other elements that have come in that are now changing the dynamics and the power dynamics, and we need to have a national conversation about where those lines are drawn, and I think we're both very much looking forward to that.
Excellent. Thank you. Can we give these guys a hand? Well, it is just after 9:30, and we did say we would be finishing at this time. I want to thank all of you for being here this evening and participating in this evening's discussion on mental health. A big thank you also to our panellists, our Zoom participant and our politicians. Can we give everybody a big hand, please? We have been video recording tonight's session, and in a few days' time that should be up on the church website with a link to that if you want to go back and have a look or want to tell other people about it to have a look. In a month's time we have a third and final panel discussion for this year's winter series, and it'll be here on Monday, August 2, if you want to put that in your diary, and it'll be exploring the important issue of food security. Hope to see you then. I'm going to say a short karakia now, in this case a blessing, and then you're invited to stay for a cup of tea or coffee and to chat, continue these conversations. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God the Father and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with all of you forever and ever. Amen. Thank you all. Please enjoy a cuppa and conversations.